Welcome to Lead with Purpose. I'm Ron Boire. This series is about real conversations with leaders who are building something that matters, how they define their purpose, navigate crisis, and make the hard calls that shape their companies, their teams, and their lives. Our first guest is someone I've had the privilege of working with for many years. Rita McGrath is a professor at Columbia Business School, a Thinkers 50 top-ranked strategist, and my partner on many projects. We sat down at Columbia to talk about the future of work, AI's impact on leadership and companies, and what it really means to lead through transformation. You'll also get a look at the personal journey behind one of the world's most respected strategic minds, how Rita thinks, what shaped her, and what drives her work today. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Love the vest, by the way.
Philson.
It's very nice.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Rita.
It's great to be here.
We just spent the day together here at Columbia Business School. I think we were talking earlier. We've done this class. You've been doing this class how long?
Since 1998.
Oh, my Lord. Okay. Rita,
Back then, it was the internet. What are we to make of the internet?
And yes, and today we spent the better part of all my morning sessions saying, what are we going to do to deal with AI and artificial intelligence, and where does that all go, and how do I survive? So that's like a typical conversation for us. It's like every day is like, tell me how to survive this thing. Tell me what I do with my company and myself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do I get myself ready? So a little bit of background. So Rita and I work together, and we've been working together. How long now? So it's over 3 years. 8 years working together on Valise.
Since you decided to embark on Ron 2.0.
Yeah, exactly.
But before that, 20, easily 20.
Yeah, 20 years or so. So we initially met Bill Klepper, the legendary Bill Klepper from Columbia Business School, I guess, introduced us. And you were doing an excursion in New York for some people who wanted to know what business was like, right?
Uh-huh. Well, what it was it was for ING Bank.
Yeah.
And they had a very forward-thinking HR leader who said, we've got these people coming up who are going to be senior leadership in the bank, and they don't know how to work together as a team.
Right.
So he conceived of this thing called the Leadership Expedition. And the Leadership Expedition was
somebody get me an expedition hat.
That's right. You need that. So what he wanted a mix of academic input, but then he also wanted them doing things together. Company visits, experiential stuff, and that kind of thing. And so I was looking, they wanted exposure to technology. This was back in the day when Sony was one of the leading lights in what technology was all about. And Bill introduced me to you, and you very kindly hosted our whole party at Sony.
Yeah, we were at 550 Madison there. That was the AT&T building built with monopoly money. What a spectacular building that was.
Gorgeous.
So for our viewers and listeners, we're here with Rita McGrath. Rita is an old friend. I frequently say, don't have a sister, but if I did, her name would be Rita. They've known each other forever. Rita is, I will say it because you blush when you say it, considered probably the leading strategist on the planet today. Thinkers 50 #1 strategist. Published a number of books. We'll talk about some of those as we kind of go through our conversation. And we actually worked together at a company that Rita founded about
2016.
Yeah, in 2016, so 10 years ago. And I think I started working with you around 2018 or 2019 with Valise, and on and off between my various excursions, some magic, some tragic. And we do a bit of work on strategic transformation, leadership development, team development, and we finally kind of found our groove and how we do that. And it's just an absolute delight working with you. Full disclosure, we work together, so we'll probably say too much nice about each other and not challenge each other enough, but that's developed over the years. I see you, so you have your own podcast, which you started during COVID, Fireside Chats. It's become extremely popular, so if people aren't subscribing to that, go do that. And everything I see about Rita online is kind of current state Rita, right? So I do want to talk a little bit, give some people some background on you and like, where does Rita come from? How did she get here? What does she want to do when she grows up? So let's start with that. I know your father was a researcher at Kodak, back when Kodak was king, and in Rochester, New York. So tell me a little bit about growing up as Rita and the daughter of Dr. McGrath.
Oh, sure. So my mother was a microbiologist. My dad was an organic chemist. So they were both researchers. After the war, they both studied in England, and that's where they met. Yeah. And then they went looking for jobs, and one that offered them a job that was sort of close to each other. So their original idea was one of them was going to take a job in the New York area, and the other one was going to take a job in Montreal, and they would commute. See, this is the thing about Europeans. They look at an American map and they think they're European proportions.
Everything looks so close.
So once they were just abused of the idea that they could do that, they ended up taking roles at the Yale School of Medicine as researchers, not as teachers, but as researchers. And so I was born in New Haven.
So you're the underachiever in the family.
Totally. Yeah. My dad very famously said to me once, he said, "So you mean in your field, developing a hypothesis is considered science?"
It's actually doing something? Thanks, Dad.
So, but the thing is, when you grow up with two research-oriented parents, and we had a very lovely time there. So my mom worked, but dinner was always a family thing, and arguments would come up at dinner, and there was nothing that came up that could not be resolved by resorting to a textbook of some kind. Yeah. And so lots of arguments. So I really grew up, thinking of answers in books and thinking of research as that. And then when I was about 8, my dad made the radical move to leave academia and take a job with Xerox. And what was interesting about that
was Xerox was Xerox, right?
Oh, yeah.
Big research
they owned
company.
The world. This is around the era of Xerox PARC, so the Palo Alto Research Center. And so my dad had been there. He'd read what were the early Pendery papers, which predicted the internet. He'd worked with a computer mouse. He would come back with these fantastical tales of what this was like. And then over the passage of years, by about 1980, Xerox began to move in a direction that didn't really suit his ambitions. And he discovered Kodak. Yeah. And went to interview at Kodak, and very famously sat across the desk from a guy named Thomas Whiteley. And Whiteley was the chair of the Kodak Emulsion Research Laboratory. So, you nick him in the arm, he bleeds silver halide, that kind of guy. And, so Whiteley said to my dad, "Tell me what you see as the future." And I remember he'd been to the future. He was at Palo Alto. He'd seen a mouse. He'd seen the Ethernet. He'd seen what was coming. And he laid it all out. He said, 8mm films have had it. Film is probably going to give way to digital, blah, blah, blah. But the future exactly as we now have come to know it. And Whiteley kind of freezes and looks at him and he's like, "Thank you very much for your advice. Wolfgang, please go back to the research labs where you can do minimal damage." Yeah. So I had a pretty normal growing up in the Rochester area. We actually lived in a town called Webster, which is near where Xerox had its sort of one of its operational facilities. And when it came time to go to college, looked at a bunch of different places, eventually landed on Barnard College, moved to New York City at that point. And I've kind of been knocking around the New York area ever since.
Yeah, you've recently moved from the east side to the west side.
Total trauma in New York City.
John went through all that trauma of having to find new restaurants.
Oh, it's nothing to eat on the west side. We know that.
Everybody knows that. It's a vast wasteland. Yeah. And then how did you end up at Wharton?
At Wharton, so I went to Barnard, got my master's in public administration from the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, did about 9 years in government and during the Koch administration in New York City. And what people don't realize is in government, if you're any good at all, like your career just skyrockets. I mean, you just get promotions and responsibility and you have enormous influence. And then there comes a point where it just flatlines for the rest of your life. Right. And I kind of got to that point. By this time, John and I were married. We were in the process of producing our first child. And I thought, well, maybe some kind of change would be a good thing. Now, at that time, business had gone very much into finance. So finance was taking off. This was in the 80s and the bonfire, the vanities era. We had the first private equity, big deals. We had all this stuff. And as a consequence, business schools were in high demand. And there was also a parallel thing going on, which was that business schools were coming under criticism for not having enough PhD-trained, pure academic people in the front of the classroom. So there was enormous demand for PhDs in business, and the market was really growing. And I'd always been interested in business. And, my parents were scientists, so having a PhD didn't frighten me. And so my husband and I talked it over, and his position was that if you get into a top 5 school, it's worth doing. If you don't, it's not. So that's very
If you don't know John, that's very John. Like, if you're going to do it right, do it. Otherwise, don't waste your time.
Exactly. Remind me to tell you about my wedding ring one of these days. Anyway, so I got into the Wharton School and showed up at Wharton. And during my time with the city, I'd been responsible for, bring back your memory, we called it computerization. Remember we called it computerization? And
did you have punch cards?
We did.
Oh.
We had word processors that then transferred the data into the big mainframe. But anyway, so I got fascinated by what I call the science of implementation, and ended up at Wharton in the Entrepreneurship Center, which was directed by a guy named Ian McMillan.
Yeah.
And Mac was a very gruff, very earthy South African, but had this entrepreneurship center, which was brand new for Wharton. This was when entrepreneurship wasn't yet cool.
So that's where you and Ian connected.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So that was the first time you kind of met worked together.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. I was introduced to him by a guy named Ed Molt, who was a practitioner who had joined the center because he was a habitual entrepreneur. I mean, he just couldn't resist starting businesses. And so he thought it would be really fun to work with students doing that. And he was sort of looking for people to work with the center, found me, introduced me to Mac, and he said, I think she might be great for some of these projects that we've got to work on. Because I'd been working, I'd actually been a working manager, so he was kind of looking for that. Mac was like, well, what are you thinking of studying? And I said, science of implementation. I think that would be fascinating. And he looked at me and he said, I can't think of anything more boring than the science of implementation. So thankfully for me, into the picture comes a guy named Ira Rimmerman, who was senior vice president at Citibank at the time. And he was absolutely convinced that Citibank had been a bank that was very successful by doing in-house ventures. So things like the first point of sale system, the first ATM, broad-span commercial ATM, phone banking, things like that. And they also had tremendous
calling
failures.
Your bank on the phone. It's revolutionary.
Amazing.
You still can't do
But they also had huge failures. And he was just fascinated at why that was. So he gave Mac Center a grant for a 3-year study of venturing at Citibank. And he wanted us to study both the ones that worked and the ones that didn't, which was great because we had license to talk to anybody about anything. And I was the director of that program. And that's what got me not too far from science of implementation, but into corporate innovation and corporate venture.
Wow. So, so you and Ian wrote was that your first book you wrote?
First book was Entrepreneurial Mindset.
And was that with Ian?
That was with Ian.
Okay. Yeah. And so that was a breakout book.
Well, it wasn't. So I have a piece of advice for you. If you're going to publish a book with entrepreneurship in the title, do not publish it after the greatest meltdown of the entrepreneurial ecosystem in living memory.
Yeah. So what was that like?
Well, it was 2 things about first books that I think are worth remembering. The first thing is you don't realize there will be many more books to come. And so you throw everything you ever thought of in this first book. So they're all like this thing. And the second thing was that you really want to have the courage of your convictions when it comes to things like the title. And the reason it ended up being called Entrepreneurial Mindset was our editor at the time was very convinced that given the dot-com rise and given there was a lot of genuine fear at the time. You may remember the merger of AOL and Time Warner had everybody panicked about, oh my God, if this upstart internet company can buy Time Warner, what's going to happen to all of us? I mean, Walmart was considering opening a digital division. There was a lot of panic in the streets at the time. And of course, after the crash, everybody was like, I told you so. This was never going to come to anything.
Until it became something.
Yeah, we wanted to call it discovery-driven strategy early on, building on the success of discovery-driven planning, which actually was a breakout piece for us. So discovery-driven planning came out in 1995, and the book came out in 2000.
And I think Clay Christensen called it one of the great strategic platforms of all time.
Yeah, he called it one of the most important ideas in strategy ever developed, which was very kind of him.
Yeah. So then what's the journey to Columbia? How do you get?
Oh, that was an accident.
Yeah.
So
all the good stuff. All the good stuff's an accident.
All the good stuff's an accident. So I was planning, I'd finished my dissertation. I'd finished my dissertation. I defended it, and Ed Molt had helped me raise enough money to do a postdoc year at Wharton, which would have been perfect because I had two little kids
Postdoc at Columbia.
at Wharton. No,
Oh,
at Wharton.
okay.
So not in Columbia, at Wharton. Because I had two little kids at the time. It meant I didn't have to start teaching until I had a little more research under my belt. It was just, it sort of fit my life at that time. And then I got a call from Ming Chen, who was working here at Columbia at the moment. And he was on the search committee for a role that they had open in the strategy group. And he basically called and said, look, I know you're planning to take this year off, but if you think you might want to join our strategy group, I can't promise you that job will still be open in a year. So why don't you come down, give a job talk? We'll take you to dinner, no harm done. And I'd finished my dissertation, so that was pretty straightforward to put that into a job talk, and successfully defended it and everything. So came down, the job talk went very well. That particular year, Ranjay Gulati swept the job market. Everybody wanted Ranjay. He's now at Harvard. But he had to pick one place at the end of the day. So I was Columbia's number 2. And so when Ranjay finally accepted a job, Columbia called me, and that's how I ended up joining here.
So you were like number 2 in our program, number 1 in our heart.
Oh,
One of those deals. So that's awesome. And so that was 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Columbia journey has been, so I was here 20 years ago. So you were still, just figuring it out, right? After only a decade.
Only a decade.
Yeah. So, so that leads us a little bit into today, right? And again, back reflecting on this morning and what's happening with AI and acceleration and the discontinuity. One of the things that fascinated me about, and this is I think the 3rd or 4th group I've done this with in the last month or so, where you have 30 to 50 executives in a room. And you say something like, hey, who's using AI every day? Or who understands? I think the question I asked this morning was, who knows what OpenClaw is?
Oh, yeah.
And was it one hand went up?
One hand.
One hand. So it's 35 executives around the world. Probably the biggest news in artificial intelligence, for sure the biggest news in AI in the last 6 months is OpenClaw. And one executive knows. Well, what was your 2? You were not allowed to sit back there. You didn't raise your hand because you weren't allowed to. But in the class, one executive knows. What did you think when you saw that?
Well, I think it's a phenomena that we see often, which is at this level in the company. So these are pretty senior executives, very global. They have huge challenges in front of them, and they allow themselves to get so deeply buried in the activities needed to get through today that to carve out 45 minutes or half an hour or an hour where they can't show the payback, to play with something where they don't know what it is, they don't know if it's applicable, it could just be a flash in the pan, there's nobody asking them to, there's nobody rewarding them to do it. I think they let themselves move so far down the rabbit hole of today's busyness that they just don't make the space for that.
Yeah.
And you don't just see that with OpenClaw, you see it with innovation, you see it with trends, you see it with paying attention to the future. And I think unless people deliberately grab hold of their schedules and make the time to commit to exploring these uncertain things, they're going to get caught by surprise.
Yeah. It's of course the module that I was supposed to teach today, which I got most of it out, was, leading through transformation and what does that look like? Some of the conversation today was like, well, how hard is this? And the analogy I use all the time is I teach in this class 3 or 4 times a year. Thank you very much. I enjoy it. And typically there's 30 or 35 people in the class, or 30 to 35 people. I'm talking at an executive roundtable, and we'll talk about personal transformation. And I'll say something like, hey, there's 35 people here. 10 of you will be disinterested in what I have to say. 25 will have interest. 15 will try it, and 1 will succeed. And that's kind of what you see in real transformation work. How do we change that? Like, what's the methodology, or is there even a methodology in the individuals and companies that want to change will, and the ones that won't?
I think there's a methodology. I do. And I believe that when it's implemented properly, that that change could happen. I think AI is going to be a big accelerant, because one of the reasons transformation is so hard is in the historical corporate structures we've inherited do a bunch of things that make it very hard to even see what's going on. So we separate tasks into similar tasks. So we put those tasks in what we call functions, and those functions are like in boxes and lines. And the reporting structure becomes the way things are aligned. But the reporting structure, as you well know, has absolutely nothing to do with how work actually gets done in the company. So information flows in these very convoluted paths throughout the organization. You would be hard pressed in a typical company to say who actually are the critical holders of the corporate culture way of advancing the who knows what the secret sauce is of how we get success, right? And if you don't know that and you try to embark on a transformation, it's almost like you're dealing with trying to put together a television with half the parts missing, and you've got to go figure that out. So one of the, I guess, three things I think that give you hope on this. The first thing is that we are seeing organizations experimenting with different ways of managing. And the consequences of that are we're seeing a flattening of structures. So people have a lot more visibility across the organization. They're not fighting their way through 11 layers of permission, right? The second thing is AI is now able to make transparent what was very difficult to make transparent before. And then the third thing is I think we're getting a lot smarter about what getting ahead means. So I'll give you the example of what they're doing at Bayer, which is being led by CEO Bill Anderson and his kind of right-hand guy, Michael Lurie. And what they're doing is they've worked out a system where everybody has a home, a professional home. So
Right.
if I'm an engineer, I have an engineering home. If I'm a marketer, I have a marketing home. And it's your home that figures out what level you are, how much you get paid, what your scope of authority is. And that's where you kind of live in your career.
Right.
Separately, there are a series of jobs and tasks and teams that operate on 90-day cycles. And the cycle to which you are assigned, the thing you're doing this 90 days, has a bearing on whether you advance, but it doesn't make that decision. Your organizational home has a group of people who are, say, 2 or 3 levels above you in your specialty that would give you feedback, decide when it's time to promote you, settle your compensation, tell you when you're screwing up, right? So that's where the feedback from the job comes in. But here's the thing. It takes so much of the return on politics out of the system that it's just magical. And people are now starting to settle into that.
How long have they been doing this?
They've been doing this 2 years now, and Michael would tell you they're about, you think, 60% of the way there. So what they've done is they've broken work into thousands, literally thousands of small teams, which are largely empowered to make pretty critical decisions on their own, and which can do things at a local level that can then search around the company. So as an example, there was a technical problem in one of their local subsidiaries, and to get corporate R&D and manufacturing and engineering and design to make this fix to something that just wasn't working with the local structure, the team there made a 3D printed part, allowed it to solve this particular problem, and shaved probably 2 years off of the cycle time it would have taken had it gone through the normal process.
Well, that fits into some of your writing about dematerialization and how the world is changing. So the ability to 3D print something massively changes the whole supply chain, engineering, design, in the art of the possible.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating. So um, you write and talk a lot about the future, right? So Bear's an example. Broadly, what do you see as the kind of the mega trends in terms of how things work? And I know you're working on yet another book.
Yet another book.
Embarrassing me because I don't have my first one out. I won't take it personal. So talk to me a little bit about, how are you thinking about the future of work, and what are you hearing when you talk to CEOs and boards and leadership teams about the future of work?
Sure. Well, it's all over the map. So I think the first big thing that is really different is the fundamental unit of value creation has now dropped to the level of teams and even individuals. So there's an Israeli engineer who literally took 6 months by himself, built a piece of software that proved so valuable that Wix paid him $80 million after 6 months of work to acquire it. One person. Now, if you extend that across a range of digital products, if you think about it, a lot of products are turning into digital goods. Music. You used to buy a CD, right? I mean, you paid for 14 songs when you get to one that you wanted. And now you don't even buy them. You rent them. They fly through the air. You don't even choose what you're listening to. Some algorithm curates it for you. And so in that world, small teams don't need a lot of capital to make something happen. They don't need permission from some big organization. They don't need a bespoke manufacturing facility. They can just get up and go. So I think what we're starting to see is companies sort of responding to this, not in a really proactive and intelligent way, but we've got these waves of layoffs that as we speak are happening right now. And I think this is almost like an instinctive response to this trend, which is, wait a minute, if my unit of value creation is these small, very valuable teams, I don't need 50 people in that role, right? So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing we're starting to see is the dissolution of the functions. Now, for your listeners, it might be important to remember when we first introduced the concept of bureaucracy, which was brought to the world by Max Weber, I think it was published in the 1920s. That was considered a massive advance over the process that came before. It was considered scientific. And bureaucracy has the following characteristics: the specialization into functions, so that you had experts in the function doing various things. You had clear layers of reporting. So it wasn't just the boss telling people what to do. It was, okay, here's the rules, right? There was a rule book for the very first time for how organizations could be. Before that, it was like the boss just made it up in terms of who was going to do what, who was going to report to who, and there was no structure. And what that did was that severely limited how big firms could get. So before you had bureaucracy, you had firms that topped out at maybe 150 people on a manufacturing site. After you had things like bureaucratization and rules around scale, the early railroads being examples of this, where they wrote down the rules of how you operate, then you could start to have mega companies. You could start to see railroads emerging. You could start to see, clear line. You started to see professional managers. You never had that before. It was always owner operators kind of people. So I think what we're on the brink of now is that model has kind of come to the end of its usefulness. And now what we're seeing is people experimenting with alternatives, where alternatives are a company like Morningstar, which is one of the world's largest tomato processors. And they're experimenting with getting rid of managers altogether. And they run the place by what they call a colleague letter of understanding, or clue, they call it. And what they do have a CEO, but what he decided to do was say, if I take the resources I would spend on a $200,000 manager, break that down, give my people a little bit of a bump in salary, but then invest the rest of it in training, teaching them how to do this. And what I think a lot of companies mess up today is they're like, congratulations, you're empowered, have a nice life, without any training. So what you need to learn is, among the things
And do
managers
they really empower them, right? Or is it?
Well, part of it's just empowerment theater, but
Sure.
but even if they genuinely mean it, you know yourself, how do you have a difficult conversation? How do you resolve tensions? How do you make sure that people are living up to their commitments? Like, we all love the freedom part, but the accountability part, like, who wants that?
Don't hold me accountable. I'm busy being free.
So there are some early models that we can point to where, we do seem to be getting past this sort of ennui that's around jobs. And I think what we know about human motivation is, if you look at Dan Pink's work, it's at least 3 essential ingredients. I need to have agency. So I need to feel I have some control over what I decide to do at work. I need to feel inspired. So I need to feel that I have some greater purpose that I'm going after. And I need to grow. I need to develop mastery. So I need to connect to an opportunity to expand my scope and learn. And a lot of today's jobs just don't offer that. So when you talk about the future of work, I think we're going to look at people being able, for the first time, at like a mass scale, to opt out of these systems that have kind of stultified them and move towards smaller systems where, if I can join a small team and add value and get value in return and grow and learn, why would I stay with Acme Corp?
Yeah. I mean, it's this whole idea of, we talked a lot about it in the class today. It's interesting how we've talked about these concepts now for quite some time, this concept of purpose and agency and the question today was like, how do I grow? How do I survive? But it always comes back to, you're responsible for you.
Yeah.
Right. And, so one of the things, this whole idea of permissionless, right? So we have no managers. We've distributed that salary someplace. And how does that collide with AI and, what the machines can do? And we did we actually did a workshop recently where we did a simulation with a very progressive company we asked them to think about how do they invest in a robotics company and how would that work within their company. It was just a fascinating exercise. And we got to one point in the exercise as we were going through our V process and the Lee's kind of innovation platform, you get to this final step where you have to say, we're going live. This is a simulation, right? And, you saw pieces of this, and this was the working group that I was in, but the simulation, and in the middle of the simulation, one of the vice presidents says, this is really stressful, right? This is like, I'm like stressed out. Like and I think the commitment level was, or $95 million of like not real money, like we're in a simulation. But what I was thinking about in that situation is there's people cut out for this and there's people not cut out for this. And if we think about where's the world going in terms of, there's a lot of talk about this. You've talked about, I've talked about, others have talked about it. I don't know if it's one of those things that's directionally correct and specifically wrong, but these smaller and smaller organizations of one or two or a handful of people that use technology, everybody has to be an entrepreneur in that environment.
Exactly.
And not everybody's cut out for it.
Exactly right.
So how do we enable that? And the people who aren't cut out for it, the people who are like, and it was just stunning to watch this individual. He's like looking at the paper and he's like, this is really stressful, right? And it was, no, we're pretending now. We're not actually going to write a check for $95 million. But do you have the right information to do that? And by the way, that simulation was one of those that was supposed to have that effect on people. It was supposed to be like, I'm not sure about this. Like, should I spend this money? Right? Which is kind of the beauty of the discovery-driven growth process, which of course you invented. So you've also been writing a lot, kind of sticking with this future work about that, you just wrote an article that was fantastic about the death of the billable hour.
Yes.
Which, as someone who doesn't love consultants, even though we do consulting, really made me feel good. I have to tell you, I felt great after I read that article. Talk to me a little bit about that. Why is the billable hour have to die? I mean, I worked for you for an hour and, here's my bill. What's your problem? Pay the bill. I mean, what's going on here?
Well, I think the issue with the billable hour is that became, in many industries, it became the proxy for value. So I don't know what value I'm actually.
So I'm a consultant and I've worked for you for an hour, so you owe me $1,500, whatever.
With AI, that same output could be achieved in 5 minutes. And so the value that you're creating is no longer really aligned with how much time it took you to do that. The billable hour also has some very severe maladies to it. So it doesn't reward efficiency. It encourages you to be inefficient.
It actually encourages the opposite.
Exactly. Right? It also, makes your clients angry, right? Because it's incomprehensible to them how this thing took 2,000 hours and that thing took 2. And the most important thing to me is it doesn't align the outcome that they're asking you to provide with the pay that they're willing to pay you. And now with AI, that whole equation's been just knocked on its ears. And I think what we're going to start to see is people edging much more towards, here's the outcome I want, here's what it's worth to me, here's what I'll pay you to get it.
It's interesting because, when we work together, we've never done billable hours. And then what I tell clients is we don't even know how to do that. It's way beyond our ability to figure out how long I worked for you. But I kind of get it with you and, maybe to a lesser extent with me. Like I have all this experience. I've done these things. You kind of changed the world of innovation and strategy. And like somebody gets to hang out with you, they should write a check, right? So you're going to give them insights. And I've seen it, right? Give them insights that they wouldn't otherwise get. But how about if I'm this, I'm your typical McKinsey intern. I just came out of Columbia and, I'm on the bench and they're taking me off the bench and how do I as a client think about that? Like, where's the, where does the inference come from there, right? So inference is the hot word right now. All these AI models are trying to become inference models, which is, I think, the human superpower of this inference. So good luck copying us. Maybe they can do it. But if I'm paying for insights and I'm paying for that, what happens to these kids? Like,
well, I think we're seeing two branches part ways, right? So one branch of companies is saying, hey, wait a minute, this is our seed corn for the future. Like we don't get these people into some kinds of assignments, maybe not the ones they had before we had really advanced AI, but some kind of mentoring, observing, client facing assignments when we need them to be able to step up. We're not going to have anybody to fill those shoes. And then there's the much more short-sighted group, which is basically saying, we can't bill out for those kids, so we're not hiring. I really don't think they're thinking down the road. Now, I think the more venal of them are thinking, I get it. We're going to save money now by not grooming those people. And then when these other firms that have made the investment in grooming these people, when we start to realize we've got problems, we're just going to poach them from these other people. And the trouble is they may be right. And so I think almost as a society, we have to figure out what our norms are around that. So if I'm a young person, right, what do I want to be thinking about? It may not be a 4-year college degree. It may be doing a series of projects. In fact, you and I just had a parent ask us our advice. Should this kid buckle down and do another academic thing, or should they do this really interesting project? And both of us said, do the project for sure. So I think what we're going to be looking for more and more are people that have demonstrated they can take what they've learned and do something meaningful with it. Now, I think at the same time, throughout all of human history, young things have learned by doing whatever the equivalent is of apprenticeships with older things, right? So back in the hunter-gatherer days, a village elder would teach you how to throw a spear and teach you how to skin a antelope and teach you how to light a fire. Knowledge of that kind, that sort of tacit knowledge, has always been passed from elder to younger people. And what I think a lot of people aren't appreciating right now, and this is aligned with your concept of inference, is a lot of the most important information in companies, and you talked about this with the mass layoffs, it's tacit. It's how do you get stuff done? It's what's the right way to talk about this thing? It's what words do you use? What sequence do you do things in? And that's really hard to codify. And if you can't codify it, it's really hard for the AI to know what the right context is. So an analogy I would use is if you take translators. I mean, if I'm a 50-year-old translator translating cookbooks, right, I would be concerned because you don't need a lot of subtlety with a cookbook. It's boiled down. It's a recipe. If I'm a 50-year-old translator working for the negotiations over what's going to happen in the Middle East, I want a human being there, right? I want to know who's got their arms folded, who's leaning back, who's kicking somebody under the table. Like, I want all that rich contextual information. And that's the inference thing.
Yeah, that is for sure. And we work with leaders and organizations every day that I wrote about this on my Substack last week, that are investing in those people. But it's got to be incredibly hard. Like one of the things we talked about, today was, you look at the Q4 GDP last year in the US, GDP grows and jobs don't.
Yeah.
Right? You look at the decline in new job postings since, ChatGPT launched that famous chart, and we'll put the chart up in a sub so people can see it for those watching the video. It's kind of scary, right? And you have quote unquote great companies, and I use air quotes on that for those not watching, laying off 15,000 people and laying off 30,000 people. And you had Block announce last week or the week before,
40%,
laying off 40% of their workers. And, what I thought was comical in that whole thing was, I'm laying off 40% of my workers because of AI. Okay, that's a decision. Is it the right one? I'm not sure. How do you pick 40? Then he said, to be humane, right? So, I don't want people to be surprised. Next year, I'm going to lay off 20%, and then the year after that, another 20. Well, I can predict what's going to happen there. So what's going to happen there is you're going to have the 60% all looking for jobs.
Sure.
And you know who leaves, right?
The best ones.
The best ones, the ones that can leave. Right. And so now he's going to be stuck 3 years from now with,
Absolutely.
the worst possible mix of employees. Right. So I think you're right in that the cynical ones, and I'm not saying he's one of the cynical, but it certainly looks that way, would say, well, I'm just going to take the efficiency and let that drop to my bottom line. and then I'll just go poach somebody. But what they've lost is all the internal inference. What they've lost is all the
tacit knowledge,
all that context, all of that stuff.
So to come back to jobs just for a second, because I think we have come to think about jobs in a way that I'm not sure is best. So our thinking about jobs is really informed by, you mentioned GDP, all the way back to Adam Smith. A job is something you do because it provides an output somewhere. And a lot of things that we call jobs are, in large organizations, they're either I'm making something, or I'm calculating something, or I'm doing something. But there's a huge amount of work in our society that does not get paid for. So if you imagine, and there's a great book called Who Made Adam Smith's Dinner, which I think is just such a
I know the answer to
fascinating
this.
concept. but if you think about the amount, and I've actually got a blog on this, which is why do we measure everything except those things that make life worth living?
Right.
So if you think about what makes it worth being a human being, it's not going to a factory all day long and plugging Lego blocks into each other, right? It's culture, it's care, it's spirituality, it's looking out for one another, it's raising children, it's all that work, and there are a lot of reasons why it doesn't get compensated. But imagine a world where your job, right, was to actually perform a useful service for other human beings, and it wouldn't be intermediated by a market with necessarily money, but it would be intermediated by a market that estimated value, right? And we've kind of gone way down this rabbit hole of financialization in most of the Western world, where money's the only thing that matters. Money's the driver. And yet, if you look at what really matters, everybody will tell you it's relationships, it's community, it's a sense of belonging, it's all that stuff. And yet somehow we haven't figured out how to put that in the economic equation. Now, there are places that do that. So if you go to my friends at Finland, I do a lot of work there.
Mm-hmm.
The government has made a series of choices that we are going to take care of daycare. We're going to take care of education. We're going to pay teachers really well. It's very hard to get a job as a teacher in Finland, like an ordinary teacher. We are going to tax you like crazy. If tax rates are going to be high because we're taking care of this stuff for you, oh business. You capitalists go out and do what you do, which is be capitalists. We're not looking to you to provide healthcare. We're not looking to you to provide education. We're not looking to you to provide social benefits because that's what government is for. And we're going to decide, how those benefits get measured. There's two funny stories from Finland. There's one jail in Finland, which has a terrible problem.
A jail? As in like you're behind bars.
Yeah. As in you're behind bars, but they don't do it that way. So this jail is set in a kind of a remote area. There are no bars. There's no fences. There's people who are trained in bringing people back into society, not being.
I didn't know people in Finland broke the law. I mean, this is revolutionary to me.
They're probably all from Eastern Europe. But anyway, no harm to the people in Eastern Europe. But anyway, they've got a big problem. Tourists are breaking into these jails.
Okay.
They're considered so interesting in such natural places. So now they've got to figure out a way to keep the inmates in and the tourists out. Right. It's fascinating. But I think the philosophy is that if you're going to create a society, there's the balance you need between what people do just for money and what people do that creates a society we want to live in.
That's amazing. So one of the topics today was UBI, Universal Basic Income, and if you believe the abundance folks, the Peter Diamandis. I always mispronounce his name, but Peter Diamandis and that whole crowd were in this abundance cycle, and Star Trek is the future, and we're going to walk up to a machine and it's going to hand us food, and we just go away. And so, what does the world look like to get to that kind of point, right? So,
well, I think part of the dilemma is that we have so conflated meaning and purpose with
money.
With conventionally defined jobs. That we've lost the notion that you can find meaning and purpose in life a lot of ways. Now, the thing about UBI, there are arguments for and against. If you buy the idea that a job in the future won't be, the man in the gray flannel suit reporting into IBM at the age of 24 and emerging with a gold watch 40 years later, right? That's not going to be the job of the future. So the job of the future may be created by constellations of ecosystems. You could have 4 or 5 or 7 or 10 relationships that are sort of gigs or projects or whatever. Now, if that happens, the dilemma that you've got is you'll have peaks and valleys in your income. So one of the things that a universal basic income structure of some kind could alleviate is when you're in a peak, you pay taxes. When you're in a trough, you get some benefit. So it's not everybody gets the same amount of money. So I think that's one issue to kind of.
So is the tax in that? So this is good because I've everybody talks about, not everybody, many people talk about UBI, and I've never kind of understood how it might work. So would the tax system become the incentive system?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what you'd also do is you'd tax different stuff. You wouldn't tax, for example, right now we tax labor.
Yeah.
And what we know about incentives is if you want to get something to happen, right? So if you want to prevent something from happening, you tax. So what we have is we don't tax transactions, financial transactions. We don't tax accumulated wealth to any great degree, or if we do, they're toothless taxes. Only people that don't have good tax attorneys do that. So the really wealthy people don't pay state tax. We don't tax goods as much. We don't tax other things. So when you think of why are we taxing the benefits of labor? If we didn't tax labor, but we instead tax things like consumption or whatever, then what you could set up is a UBI system where you figure out what your standard of living is that you want the bulk of your population to have access to. And then if somebody earns less than that in a given period of time, they get some kind of benefit. If they earn more than the level in a certain period of time, they contribute to the tax.
Yeah. So below a certain level, you pay no tax. I mean, in the United States today, functionally, if you're married and below 75 or 80,000, you're functionally paying no tax.
Yeah.
Problem is most people think they're paying tax and they're not actually. So structurally, there's this mythology that, we all know that the top 10% is paying most of the tax. Yet it feels like the distribution system is not reflecting that, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I know my wife owns a restaurant, for example, and the average person in that restaurant's paying $60,000 to $85,000 a year, and they're functionally probably paying little or no tax. Yet, I know that they think they're paying a lot of tax, right? They believe that. So the system would have to be very transparent, right? In that, all right, below this number, $100,000, zero. You won't see anything on your statement, and then it gets progressive, I guess, right? So by the time you get to be Elon Musk, they're taking 90% of it, or some number.
Well, they're not, because they're shielding it all.
Exactly, but you'd have to fix that, I guess.
You would have to fix
for the system.
There's huge amounts of tax evasion going on, both at a company level, at an individual level, at a national level.
So how do you tax assets? Like, so let's use Elon Musk, for example. Okay. He's going to be a trillionaire, probably. Maybe he is. I don't know. But he'll tell you, if I was I'll be Elon Musk for now. Like, he's one of my favorite people to love and to not love. So I'm Elon Musk. I'm feeling good right now. I'm feeling good right now. I might buy a boat.
That fitness program you were on was really
helpful. It's working out, actually. Yes, he could use that. So I have $1 trillion, and I'm in, let's pick California. I'm in California, and Gavin Newsom says, I want 5% of your $1 trillion. Whatever the number, I don't even know what the number is. I know it's out there. Call it 5%, which is 5% of $1 trillion is a whole bunch. But I don't actually have the $1 trillion. Do I take a loan to pay? How's that work?
Most people take out mortgages.
So you take a mortgage on Tesla, and then Tesla tanks, and I have $200 billion. Do I get a refund? That's what I
know. It's instrumented. And I come back to, any system like a tax system, you have to think about what are you trying to get to? Let's just take.
So what are you incenting?
Well, what are you incenting? But also, what's your goal as a society? Who do you want to do really well in your society and who not? So let's take 2 historical examples. When the income tax in the U.S. was first implemented, this was right after the Gilded Age. This was right after the labor unrest that emerged from the Gilded Age conditions, because it's very much like today. You had a very demoralized labor force that was increasingly angry that the fruits of their labor were going to very, very few, incredibly, who seemed completely untouchable, right? And the Gilded Age is an interesting example of a system that was revolutionized without a sort of a classical war. Now, there's plenty of violence. You had armed troops shooting at workers. You had violence at the factories. You had workers attacking owners and so forth. So there was a lot of kind of underlying violence, but it wasn't like an armed conflict between nations. But what started to happen, and Teddy Roosevelt was very instrumental in this, is he said, we're going to design a system where the ordinary person has a chance. And so we're going to bust up the trusts. We're going to tax income. We're going to make it very progressive. So the only people that are going to be touched by this are people indeed who are wealthy. And we're going to make sure that more of these progressive policies get introduced. So things like civil service exams for public officials, things like, making sure that everybody had to have a level playing field for things. And he was a very strong leader, and he really got through a lot of very progressive legislation that I don't think would have happened without some kind of much more violent conflagration had need not been in case. Now let's take after World War II. There was a thing called the Council on Economic Development, which is kind of a think tank, and it was set up in 1942 when World War II was still raging. But these think tank people, and there was businessmen that set it up, and then they brought in academics and thinkers and stuff. But what they did was a very careful analysis of all the screw ups since the end of the First World War. And what happened in the First World War was, when it ended, the winners impoverished the losers, basically. They destroyed their industrial base and prohibited them from having armies and all that sort of stuff. So those countries' citizens became impoverished. So in Germany, for example, this is very much like the denial of the 2020 election results, right? In Germany, there was a whole group of people that said, we never lost World War I. That's a lie. And it created a groundswell of support for, what later became fascism and Hitler. So we impoverished our enemies, destroyed their industrial base. We didn't have enough jobs for the people at home, and business was unwilling to invest because business didn't know what the demand was going to be. They'd really been freaked out by the crash, the 1920s crash. And so they weren't really willing to put capital at risk, and nobody was out there saying, don't worry, if all goes wrong, we're here for you. So what did they do after World War II? They said, we need some replacement for the stable demand of the war contracts. And they did two things. They bet on housing. So they invented the 30-year mortgage. We didn't have that before. An ordinary person could not earn enough in their lifetime to own a standalone house. Second thing, and the bet on housing included suburbanization, heavy government subsidization of highways, heavy government investment in things like cars. And once you have highways, and once you have cars, and once you can buy a house, boom, land that was not valuable at all because it wasn't close to a railroad and it wasn't in a city, now becomes valuable. So you have suburbanization, right? At the international front, they said, we're not going to make that mistake that we made after World War I again. We're going to help our vanquished opponents, and we want them to become trading partners. So we had the Marshall Plan in Europe. We had the revival of Japan in the East. America wrote the modern Japanese constitution, basically. And we're going to provide jobs for the middle class. And the marginal tax rate at that time was 92%. And the companies were happy with it. And the business leaders at the time, now this is pre-financialization, the business leaders at the time said, here's the bargain we're willing to make. Prosperous middle class means demand for our products. We want to make good products. We're going to make a reasonable profit. We're going to be profitable. We want that guaranteed demand, which the mass gives us. And what we're willing to exchange that for is we're not going to take obscene salaries. We're going to allow unionization. Now, here's an interesting thing about unionization at the time. And I think the stories we tell about unions are wrong. We tell the story of, well, the unions lost their power and therefore workers are being treated horribly and everything like that. What we forget is that the unions were industry-wide. So I don't have the General Motors Union. I have the Auto Workers Union. So what that does is it means everybody's on a level playing field when it comes to labor costs. And that was a bet that the business leaders were willing to take. They said, we like that. You have the Steel Workers Union. You have the automakers.
But it's fractured since then. They go after Ford or they go after GM.
That's the problem. And so what you've got now is each company is viewing their labor cost as a possible source of competitive advantage. And the only way you want to deal with that is you want to cut that cost as much as possible. So if I were to say, okay, if I'm the Council of Economic Development for today, what are some of the things I need to think about? Well, what are my goals, right? So do I want less income inequality, a prosperous middle class, the chance of a golden age, or do I want this system we've got now, which is creating a lot of civil and social unrest? And that came up today in class. If you've got people who have no future, no hope, no willingness to try anything, we see it in pockets of the population right now today. There is nothing for them. And therefore, they're willing to put everything, including themselves, at risk to go out in glory, right?
Yeah.
And that's not a pleasant subject to think about. So I really think we need to get some clarity around what is it we're trying to accomplish here. And then you can back into what do the policies mean. So let's say we have the decline of the megalithic corporation. Production now becomes something that becomes much more distributed. So it's not centralized big factories anymore. It's people building digital products in their virtual living rooms. The unit of analysis becomes not so much suburbs, but it becomes small pockets of productivity. Cities become a place where you go for inspiration, culture, da 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 da. They're not where you go to work necessarily. And you design a whole system radically differently than what we have right now.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a long trip, right? That's a very long trip. So you've covered. I have another 4 hours in me here, so you've covered a lot of.
It would work for me.
The decline of we have the opposite today of the decline of the megalithic corporation. We have 6 or 7 corporations that are. You have NVIDIA, you have Google, you have Apple, you have Microsoft, you have the social world with Meta. We talked about a little bit with we had 35 leaders from all over the world today, which is a great group. We talked about this a little bit that if you look at like the 10 largest companies in the world, 7 or 8 of them are in the US. Mm-hmm. And so I asked the class today, like, why? Like, why is that? And all of them from around the world universally said, it's this innovation, it's the opportunity to succeed, it's all that. And in fact, a couple from Europe were like, we think it's over for us. We're very concerned. They were extremely, I've said that I'm worried about Europe, but they're living in it, right? So I guess if you're in the pot, the water feels hotter, right? They were very vocal about it's like dog track time for us. We don't know how are we going to compete. NVIDIA is bigger than most countries. Google is bigger than most countries. It's scary. So we have that, and there's part of that that's really good, right? So we as in America, driving massive global innovation. I guess we could argue, is it good or bad? Some of it's not good at all. If you look at social media and things like that, and we just, maybe we'll touch on the trial of Facebook or Meta and Alphabet / Google. I've used the brands too.
I know.
So how do we get to? I understand in 1945 a tax rate of 92%. The U.S. economy is the only functioning economy on the planet. Didn't matter what you did, you were going to make money. Just look at the U.S. automobile industry, and it didn't matter what you made, you were going to make money. This is true. American appliances, right? So that was a different world. So on the contrarian side, is Europe suffering because of the tax structure and the lack of innovation, or is that just a cultural thing? Why didn't I think of the mega tech companies? There's one in Europe, right? So China's not as transparent, but there's certainly some companies there that have probably near $1 trillion valuations, but they're not as obvious as kind of the industrialized or the, if you will, the Western world. How do they get out of this? And how do we create a system? So let's pretend 90, you didn't say it was the number, you were giving an example. You weren't saying this is what we should do, but how do we create a system where we can do this and we still have, so one of the stats that I throw out all the time is the U.S. economy grew by about $1 trillion last year. It will grow by $1.5 trillion. It's going to grow by larger than the vast majority of countries in the world's total economy. And Europe won't grow. How do we avoid all that? How do we get the incentives right?
Well, so here's an observation I would make. A lot of the world is not participating effectively in a modern economy right
No,
now.
100%. Yeah,
Right?
completely agree with that.
So if you think what could be the equivalent of the decision to bet on housing in suburbs, and didn't mention the other thing, the Cold War was the other thing. So we're betting
Yeah.
on housing and lifestyle for ordinary people, and the Cold War for high tech military,
Yeah.
military industrial complex, all that. So those were the two ingredients after World War II. Today, what would it need to be? Well, we need to do green technology. And when I say that, I'm not trying to be, odie weedy crunchy. We don't have 8 planets to burn. The evidence is incontrovertible.
We only have this one so far.
So far.
Yeah.
I mean, Mars would be nice, but it's going to be a while.
It's hard.
So what one of the screwed up things we've got is the incentives in the society so far have tended to tilt towards a lack of investment in things that could provide energy that are not burning dinosaurs. And that's partly a political failing, but it's also an economic failing. Oil has been cheap for 80 plus years.
Yeah.
And that has allowed a lot of things to happen that are actually really sloppy. If you can just use cheap oil and you don't have to be economical, design well, or whatever.
Or you're seeing it right now, right?
You
So
see
just
it.
release this reserve. We take the oil from here. It all works out.
And it'll go back to normal, right?
Yeah.
So I think the first dilemma that faces a lot of the developed world, not just Europe, but a lot of the developed world, is China, Europe, the US. We're all contesting for mature markets. How many refrigerators are you going to be buying in the rest of your life?
2?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of them's
3.
probably for your kids, right?
Yeah. Yes, that's a whole nother topic.
We need another podcast on the
Don't push
personal
on that
side
sort
of
of subject.
So imagine a world in which you have knowledge production in, I'll call it the global north, so Europe and the US. You have a sort of phalanx of consumption that then translates to the global south. You stop sending ships full of what is basically dirt to manufacturing facilities in the developed world. You do your mining and your production close to where the mines are. You have lifestyles that are not extract, consume, dispose of lifestyles that are much more green, much more knowledge intensive, and they're smart. They're inhabited by smart, but the demand is in, call it the global south. So the only place in the world that's going to grow population is that. There's a lot of human beings there. And what you're starting to see now is the first indications of what I think could be the future of that demand materializing in a constructive way. So there's an entrepreneur in Africa, an ex-Tesla guy, who feels that Tesla is not doing enough. And so he left Tesla with a determination to do something and did an analysis which showed that in most of Africa, the biggest environmental damage is being done by these little motorcycles. They're not really motorcycles; they're like motorbikes. And
those little scooter type things. Yeah.
And when a poor person gets enough money to buy a motorbike, the first thing they do is they buy a really fuel spewing, smelly, horrible
Pollutes
motorbike.
like crazy.
It does, the whole thing. And a lot of the global south is like that. So what they did was they innovated an electric motorbike. It's strong enough to be able to carry 5 to 6 people and goods.
Mhm.
It's strong enough to be able to survive on terrain. It's really inexpensive, runs on electricity, and to make it particularly affordable, so you can only afford the bike, they will rent you the battery for the bike for 10 pennies a day. So now somebody can get into this thing. It doesn't pollute. It's better than the diesel alternative. It's cheaper than the alternative. And we've designed it so that you can grow into more consumption as your needs expand. So that's a case of taking something that was not particularly helpful or useful, expanding consumption for it. So now I got demand. These things are selling like hotcakes all over the place. Right. But it's also smart and green, right? And what they've done is they've got these recharging stations where you can either replace your battery and just put the used one back, or you can have your own battery and charge it. And it's transforming the lives of an awful lot of people. And that's an example of the kind of demand creation which we could see. But I think the thing we have to watch out for in call it the global West is we're all fighting for the same markets. Right? Europe's fighting for this market. China's fighting for. We need a new demand. We need a new place where demand's going to emerge, and that's probably going to be the global south. Yeah. So if that's true, that means we need to rethink trade. We need to rethink who's partnering with who, and we need to be interested in a longer game.
Yeah. So on this, I see the kind of the green movement where government has massively failed, right? And it's and then again, I'm not crunching granola here either, but I have grandchildren, right? And so one of the areas that you think about automobiles, right? So I've always said that I don't understand why the hybrid thing is not a thing, right? The U.S., right? So we have suburbs, drive long distances, and battery failure. That's a place where Europe is really excelling, right? It's really interesting. And as you know, we've talked about this. I have a car problem, and I freely admit I have a car problem.
Well, admitting it is the first step.
I've not bought a car since Saturday. I'm on day 5, but I just bought a hybrid electric car, and it's European, absolutely fantastic. I mean, it is a stunningly good, and it's not a crazy car, but it's stunningly good at what it does. And you drive this car, and it's a pleasure, and it'll go 50 to 75 miles, fully electric. You plug it in at night. You could pretty much around town, even up in the hills where I live, you drive all day and come home and plug it in. You'll never burn gasoline. I don't know how, and so I was asking Claude, my best friend Claude, like I was thinking about buying this thing. Hey, what incentives are out there for me? No, the number one incentive in New York State is on Long Island. With an electric vehicle, you can drive in the HOV lane with one person in your car.
Oh,
That's the
geez.
only incentive in the entire state of New York. And I was like, this is so bizarre, right? So we gone from where it was, $7,500 or $8,000 a car. And of course, there's income limits, and I probably wouldn't qualify for that anyways. But I can drive in the HOV, so that'll probably drive huge.
Huge adoption. Huge instant.
I think this is one of those tipping points that you talk about.
Inflection points?
And seeing around corners, you're talking about these inflection. I think we're at one. The HOV lane in Long Island is a really big deal.
That's great.
So as you know, I try to avoid anything that has an HOV lane. So topics beyond AI. I know, we think about these things a lot in terms of robotics, in terms of autonomous, terms of nanotechnology and biotech and fintech. How do you think about one of my favorites is robots, right? So one of the things that we talked about a little bit in the class today is if you could buy a robot for $30,000 and it could do all those things around your house that you didn't want to do, and it could mow your lawn, and it could walk your dog, and it could make your bed. I'm an inherently lazy person. I freely admit that. I mean, I would do that in a heartbeat. What does that mean for the person who currently cleans my house or currently mows my lawn? How does that world evolve? And one of the things we did talk about today, which I know you're familiar with, is the Boston Waymo fight, right? So this big fight, and I thought this was fascinating. I think it was one of my favorite podcasts, and we'll flash that up for the viewers. But I forget if it was people I mostly admire, or one of those that was talking about this fight in Boston where the cab drivers, when Uber went there a few years ago, we're all talking about, oh, you're here to take our jobs. And now the cab drivers have all become Uber drivers.
Right.
And the Uber drivers have formed a union, right? And Boston is a union town. And now they're fighting Waymo because Waymo really will take those jobs away. So that's a robot that drives a car.
Right.
And as you know, I'm a big fan of autonomous vehicles. So they're actually very, very safe. As much as I like to drive, I'm pretty sure that a Waymo drives better than I do. And I do take them when I'm out in Arizona. So that's one robot. And then you have this robot that has, arms and legs and looks like a person and has that creepy face. What's that world look like for employment and society? How does that all work for us?
Well,
is that a good thing?
It could be. I mean, nobody emerged from childhood with their highest and best aspiration to be an Uber driver. I mean,
but it is a job, right?
Oh,
it's a
this
job.
Is what I was.
It's not as good as it used to be, right? A lot of the benefits of driving really,
yes,
they're now making $7 billion a year, and so So that 7 billion came from somewhere, and it came from the drivers.
Right.
That's where it came from.
Basically.
Just to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're right. Nobody woke up and said, "Hey, I want to be an Uber driver."
Right. So if you think of the kinds of, I think we're going to have to reimagine what a job is. So if you think of human creativity, how many people want to grow up and be actors?
Well, we all pretend, but I don't know. I mean, yeah, that's interesting.
But if you think about it, if you think
Yeah.
of the call them the high desirable sort of things I would do that involve self-expression,
Yeah.
that involve connecting with other people, that involve my unique skills and capabilities. In today's environment, let's say 1,000 people want to have this idea that maybe I'd like to go up to be an actor. Only one of them's actually ever going to be able to earn a living doing that. And of that person, there's going to be a fraction of them that do really well. Right. So I think there's an opportunity to think about, it may not be a job the way that we think of it, but it might be a value creating exercise that generates some kind of ability to create a living standard, but that is beyond, the drudgery of cleaning your house. That's beyond the whatever the Uber driver does. And I think that's where we should usefully put together some creativity. So one of the things that Carlotta Perez says, and I admire her work very much, is she says, look, the lifestyles of the future are already here, but they're already in a small segment. So we were talking about hippies today.
Yeah.
So back in the 50s, macaroni and cheese was a genius product. Every Wednesday was Prince Spaghetti Day. Remember, stuff in boxes and cans
Birth
was like
of marketing.
It was fabulous. That was like the normal American meal. Often involved Jello, right? It was something out of a box.
Jello was actually a treat.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a reason for that. It was cheap. You could feed a family on very inexpensive ingredients, and you didn't need skills to cook it particularly.
Well, the rich people had the craft. We had the A&P brand.
Oh, okay.
Just to be clear.
So then you had the hippies, and the hippies were all like, no, nothing out of a box, nothing unnatural. We want hippie, granola, blah, 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 blah. All right, fast forward to today. You have John Mackey setting up Whole Foods. You have organic foods gone mainstream. You have a whole generation that would never be caught dead in the boxed cereal, the boxed pasta aisle in the supermarket. They're all shopping at the edges. Well, to me, that's an early warning. That's an early indicator that a lifestyle of quality, highly, curated, imagine farms, right? We're starting to see these vertical farms which produce greens that are minutes from where they're going to be consumed. And so you've got exchanges of value that are going to be differently processed than I think the exchanges of the past. So in the past, we rewarded mass market agriculture, a lot of cheap food for a lot of people because it gets put in a box and it lasts forever. Well, what if in the future we redefined what what a good food is, and it's comes from micro farms, and it creates value in the micro farm. And then, what if we had energy? We've talked about this coming from satellites. We're going to create energy farms on the moon. So what I think we need to be thinking about is what are the elements of a really successful lifestyle, and how could that translate into something that also provides people with the mechanism to independently and with a sense of purpose generate the means that they have to survive.
So this is the same category as UBI, right? So this is Star Trek, right? My robot takes care of me. Where do I find my purpose then? What is it?
Well, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, in that fantasy, it's about exploring the universe. The ability for people to have purpose, to have, as I described, the thing that they're going to say at your funeral, right?
Exactly.
Is one of the most important things for human beings.
But just think about right now. Think about all the work of care, community creation, and looking after each other. The demand is so huge, and the available supply is so constrained. Think about actually having time to creatively play with your child if you're a young mother. Think about having the time to really tutor somebody who needs the help older on. We were talking to somebody today who was telling us that there was a movement around getting Black people to be available to the military, like the Navy SEALs. And because people in many of the communities they grew up in simply couldn't afford swim lessons, they became adults without ever learning to swim.
Yeah, there's the guy from Houston.
Yeah, right.
About that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just think that's a very small but meaningful indicator that there is huge demand out there for building skill and capability and meaning and purpose that isn't monetized today in a way that really benefits the majority of people. So we're back now to what kind of society do you really want? And like you, I have grandchildren now, and I think if we said we want a society where the bulk of people feel that they can purposefully do meaningful work, make a living of some kind, maybe not a sumptuous one, but a comfortable one, and spend meaningful time with other human beings they care about, I think that would be really interesting.
So we talked today about GDP.
Mm.
And what is GDP? And I won't tell my GDP story, don't worry. So
You need to edit it out.
yeah, I need to edit. I would have to edit everything in my GDP story. But in this world of abundance, and there's a lot of talk about today. We have $1 trillion companies, and the first $10 trillion company is coming. And what does that all mean? And how do we measure wealth? And because to distribute it, we've got to know what it
Right.
is, right?
Right.
So not that GDP is perfect, by the way. And I think my example today of two economists trading $1 and then declaring they've created $2 in GDP was hysterical. I do think that myself. Not that GDP is perfect, but how do we measure wealth in the future?
Huge question, right? I think we're going to have to start measuring things that are not monetary. So GDP comes from, all the way back to Adam Smith. It's how much input, monetary or material or whatever input did you get to achieve a certain amount of output. And that's what we measure in GDP. But a whole lot of stuff that means important things aren't measured by GDP. Your lifespan, the quality of your life, degree of your health span, the degree of education that you got, your access to resources that you could use. I mean, right now, if I'm a bright kid and I'm in the middle, right, my access to opportunity is a fraction of what it could be if that path were paved more readily for me. And so there's just, I think one of the things we have not measured, right, enough is what are the things that genuinely contribute to human thriving that are not necessarily capturable in that kind of crisp number. Now, there's a huge infrastructure invested in preserving GDP as a core measure. There's an entire academic field of economists who look at that. But I think that just looking at productivity without considering what is that productivity actually buying you is hard. So there's an interesting guy, he's passed away now, but William Baumol was an economist. And one of the things he was interested in studying was low productivity sectors and why did they command a salary. And so he did a lot of the early work on symphony orchestras. And he would define that as a low productivity industry because it takes the same musicians the same 40 minutes as it did in the 1700s to play a Beethoven sonata, right? So by definition, your inputs and your outputs
can't play it faster. or more
unlike a bricklayer, right?
Yeah.
Whose productivity mounted. However, what he identified was that in society, what we do is we have these high productivity sectors where workers get paid more because they're happier, they produce more output. But then in order to staff the sectors of the economy that are not prone to productivity gains, we have to guarantee that their wages go up too. Now, I think Baumol had it wrong. He called it the cost disease because his theory as an economist was we should pay,
Sure.
We should have high pay and high productivity sectors and everything else in the economy should languish. Well, raising children, symphony orchestras, all the stuff that makes life worth living should be paid more. So I think of Baumol's cost disease as actually a benefit. It's how we get high productivity where it's warranted, and we'll see what AI and all those things do. But that then can flow out to the rest of the economy by raising standard of living in these low productivity sectors. So I think one of the things maybe we should be looking at is some kind of composite standard of living index. And if you imagine a digital world, just thinking about this now, if you imagine a digital world in the global south where the things that we value is getting exercise, being healthy, learning things, learning to swim, having proper dental care, having, whatever you need to have a solid life. If we measured all that stuff and the world were increasingly digital, it would get a lot easier to measure. So one of the reasons that GDP is so loved, it's something people think they can measure. Now, there's a lot of bias, and we don't need to get into that argument. But if you could measure what goes into it, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. So, on the tech side, they talk about energy and compute as really the currency of the future. I don't know. I don't know how that fits, and maybe we don't want to go down that rabbit hole. So, as an educator, what happens to learning in this future world? What is one of my pet peeves is primary education, right? And it's dominated by special interest groups. Without getting too political in that, the amount of money spent on primary education and the quality of the output is so poor in virtually every place. I mean, virtually every state, notable exceptions in some suburban areas. If you're in a major city, you're spending $30,000 to $40,000 a student to put somebody through elementary through high school, and you're getting graduation rates that are stunningly low, in some inner city rates that can be gut-wrenchingly low, and even suburban rates. So in my county in upstate New York, I know a guidance counselor at a public high school in a moderately large city, call it 50,000 people, 40,000 people. High school has a graduation rate of 70%. But if you talk to the insiders, they'll say, oh yeah, and we only achieve that with kind of social promotion.
Yep.
Right. It really would.
They don't have the
It would be
skills.
more like 40%. So graduating kids that can't read,
Right.
they can't write, they can't do basic arithmetic.
The skills that a high school graduate would have had in the 50s, let's say.
Yeah.
You have to be a college grad now to have those skills.
Yes.
So we're doing
a bachelor's degree, or at least an associate's degree.
So I think what we're going to see in education is a real shift from education as I impart knowledge to you, you show that you've mastered it,
regurgitate it back,
to how do I now use that knowledge? So there's a couple of shining examples of where this is starting to take root. One is a school called Alpha School, which was started in Texas, and they have what they call the 2-hour learning model. So what they do is they don't have
Where
teachers.
was this when I was going to school?
They don't have teachers, they have guides.
Yep.
The guides are paid a lot. The guides are paid six figures.
This is a private, obviously.
At the moment, it's a private
venture, right?
Yep. And it is supported by venture capital, which is interesting too. But the guides are paid a lot. The students are, yes, grouped by age, but their curricula is determined by level. So if I'm a third grader, but I can read at a sixth grade level, I get content fed through an AI to me that's at that sixth grade level. If I'm at sixth grade and I am struggling, I get a patient AI tutor who will go with me. And then the guide's job is to make sure the kids are properly interacting, that they're interacting with each other. So that's the 2 hours every day that they come to school, which is dedicated to math, English, whatever the conventional subjects are that students should know. The rest of the day is spent doing what they call life schools. And this starts really young. It starts in kindergarten. And so for kindergartners, it might be making a craft. It might be helping each other with a project. It might be cooking for one another. As they get older, the crafts, the skills get more demanding, to the point where they get in high school, and the high schoolers are expected to do what they call a challenge project. Now, here's an example of a non-monetary thing that could give somebody purpose. So one of their students at the age of 17 was an avid mountain biker. And there was no place near where the school was, where he lived, to mountain bike. And so he had this idea. He was going to make his project, his challenge project, to find a mountain bike park, to create a mountain bike park. And so the first attempt was, he said, well, the logical thing to do would be to go to the Parks Commission, find out what public land there was, figure out how to raise the money for it, and build a mountain park.
I think I know how that went.
It did not go anywhere. So everybody said no. Nobody had any interest at all. So then this kid, undeterred, and supported by his guides and by the, okay, let's try the next thing. So notice the resilience. We're hitting an obstacle. We're not just giving up.
So agency, then resilience.
So the next thing is he goes and looks for parcels for sale, and eventually finds one that would be suitable in terms of the terrain, not too far from means of transportation. But the price tag on this thing's $300,000 because it's owned by a private person. Okay, so that's a little bit of a challenge if you're 17 and you're not even old enough to have a bank account yet. So what this kid does is he goes to work on his social skills. He searches LinkedIn, X, YouTube, any place on the planet where anybody mentions mountain biking in a favorable way, reaches out to them on social and says, hey, I'm trying to build this thing. I know you don't know me from Adam. Could you chuck in $10? Right? I'm not asking for a lot. $5, $10, whatever you can afford to make this actual mountain bike dream of mine come alive, because you and I share the passion for this thing. Raises $300,000.
Right.
Then gets a grant to do the actual landscaping and stuff. And today that's a thriving mountain bike park out in Texas. That's his senior project. So here's the thing. He figured out how to get the resources. He figured out how to come around the obstacles. He figured out how to find his community. And that generated the economic value that today has led to the mountain bike park. And now they charge a modest amount to use it. And so that pays the bills there. Fabulous, right?
It's a long journey, though, right?
Oh,
it's
yeah.
A really long journey. And I think about New York State, for example, and teachers unions, right? And like the teachers would then say, well, then what do we do? Right. So if you have Khan Academy, I think is similar.
Another example.
Yeah, another great example of that where, I haven't kept up with it, but you can get pretty deep into mathematics and physics and a whole cadre of things. In fact, I think it's a platform that's now available in public schools and public schools. But, how do you transition from, teachers and teachers unions that are heavily political and invest literally millions and millions into political campaigns to keep things the status quo and innovate? Like how do we change that incentive system? I know there's no easy answers to that, but
it's being undermined from under them. Yeah. Because what's happening now is there's this huge movement to take dollars allocated to public education and move them into other channels. And so on the one hand, I think weakening the power of the incumbency, that has positives. On the other hand, I worry we're creating this two-tier system, where people that can afford it are going to places like Alpha School and everybody else is kind of left out.
Yeah. So on the question of networks and one of the things that you've, I think, reinforced in me, probably taught me, right, as well, is kind of the value of kind of getting to the edges, right? So this is fundamental to seeing around corners. How do you get to the edges? And what do great CEOs do, and what great leaders do, and great teachers and learners do? One of the things that I have really been focused on personally in the last 6 months, let's say, is how do I expand my network, but how do I make it younger? Right? Mm-hmm. As somebody who is allegedly getting older.
No, say it isn't so.
Yeah, it is possible that I'm getting older. I look around and I see my peers and former colleagues. They've stopped growing, right? They've stopped really accelerating their learning. In fact, they're decelerating. And I think about like my grandparents, who were very traditional grandparents. My grandfather, God rest his soul, read the Sunday Times every week. It took him an entire week to read the Sunday. You remember the Sunday Times used to be this thick. I saw the Sunday Times the other day. I'm like, is that the Sunday Times? But it used to be 300 pages. So he was a farmer in upstate New York. And I always felt like he just always kept learning in the way that he could. And I don't know if that was intentional or he was just bored and the only thing he could do at, his age and his conditions, read the New York Times, but he always seemed to know what was going on. What are you doing to keep your network fresh?
So some very specific things. I'm agreeing to do assignments which pair me up with younger people. So, for example, I'm going to South by Southwest London in June, and I'm on a panel with...
You did invite me to come with you.
You're welcome. You need a trip to London right now?
No, I probably don't. But if it was in Paris, I would go.
Anyway, so I'm partnering up with Neri Taras Silliman, who is a refugee turned entrepreneur, turned business owner, turned academic. And we're going to be on a panel together. And she's younger. She's probably in her 30s. And we're going to be in a panel together with one of the entrepreneurs that's featured in her book, Pioneers. I do invite younger people on my podcast.
Yep.
People that I think
I have 3 30-somethings coming. Yeah. Early 30-somethings coming on soon.
Teaching actually is great, and there are lots of places where people would welcome wisdom like yours to teach. I know you do a lot of woodworking. I mean, one of the things I think would be very cool is how cool would it be to like show up at a shop class now and again and
Yeah.
you know share what you know about that stuff.
Yeah.
By the way, shop students, schools that have reinstituted shop, these kids are getting $80,000 a year offers as
Oh,
17-year-olds. I
it's
mean,
it's incredible.
yeah. Did you see BlackRock is now paying for the development of electricians?
I
They're
did not see that.
yes, they're paying to invest in education for electricians because their worry is as we need all these data centers, we don't have enough electricians to go.
Yep.
So I think what you may see, and back to jobs, right? You may see a rise in these jobs that actually need hands and bodies and hearts, right?
Yeah.
And not and tacit knowledge. So teaching, deliberately reaching out to younger people, being where they are. And I have 2 kids, which is fortunate, and so sometimes I get to be a fly on the wall in the things that they're doing, which is really interesting. So I think you have to be deliberate about it, though. It is so easy to slip into the same people you see all the time, the same club you belong to, the same whatever. You have to put a little effort into it.
Yeah. And we're fortunate. We have young, highly engaged kids, and some of them. But I also worry about, how do we make sure that we stay near the edges? So I have 3 young men coming on. I don't know when I'm going to record them, but they've agreed to come on. It should be comical and educational and such, but getting that into your rhythm, and it's current for me because I'm literally at the stage of my life. So I had lunch with a friend yesterday, and he's 3 months older than me,
Mhm.
and he's like, "Well, when are you retiring?" I'm like, "Never." And he goes, "Oh, you're one of those." I'm like, "Yeah, but I don't want my brain to rot, and I
Uh-huh.
really love what I'm
Yeah,
doing." And I think where the world is going is really exciting. I'm not a doomer, right? I'm not the person who's like, "Oh, this AI thing," you know.
we're toast.
Yeah, I'm not a Nick Bostrom doomer. Not that he's necessarily a doomer anymore, but if you read Super Intelligence, you would think he was. I'm not that guy. Staying fresh, staying on the edge. You're writing about, essentially the future of work and how organizations will grow and thrive. And the people you're writing for are in their 30s and 40s. They're not in their 60s and 70s.
Exactly.
So staying fresh. What have we not talked about that's important?
Um, it's a good question. We could talk about places where we sometimes disagree.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Yeah. You mean
So
frequently?
no, but I think it's a difference in perspective, right? So
Yeah.
I remember that you were talking to one of my classes or one of my groups, and kind of laying out like how you go about structuring your day and whatever. And I kind of came up to you afterwards and I said, I have to tell you how that is going to land with a young working mother who's got 2 kids at home, who does not have the luxury of starting her day at 9:30, and who is comes home after a day of work to 2 kids who have been good all day long for somebody else, and now they are just a mess, a hot mess. And now I've got to deal with dinner and da da da. And then maybe my better half or a partner turns up at some point in this whole scenario. I said that person is not going to resonate to this message.
Yeah. Yeah, there's ways that I've modified. I actually gave that exact. It's a very similar presentation. It
Mhm.
wasn't exact. For those of you who haven't seen my keynote, it's evolved a lot, and so I focus a lot on health. I focus a lot on what do you do to understand why you're here, right? So that's your purpose. B, define what that journey looks like. That's your vision. Talk to people about your purpose is what they say at the funeral, the visions in the newspaper. And really importantly, what are your principles? And one of my key principles is health. And as you know, I've tried to become very healthy over the last several years. I've lost around 100 pounds. I'm very active. And the way I've done that is to really take control of my life. So Rita saw one of my keynotes in Dublin, actually, and she thought it was very not housewife or wife or mother centric, which it wasn't. And so there are ways that everyone can do that. And what's really interesting is uh, I coach 7 or 8 people now, and half are women.
Mhm.
Couple have children, and you're right. They don't own the morning. They get owned by the morning, right? So they have to look for different ways, and
Mhm.
we talk about what those ways are.
Mhm.
Um, but the essence of how I like to think about it is agency. It's like, how do I take control of my life and not let my life control me, right? And you're very familiar with my typical morning wake up call for an executive, like this. Oh God, like before you even out of bed. That's the big one. Like, please avoid that one. Like, don't start with the panic call in the morning. But yeah, learn, grow. Thank you for the time.
Thank you for
Rita
inviting
McGrath,
me. It's a pleasure.
my friend and one of the great strategists of the world, and my favorite and best critic.
Oh, thank you.
So
It's been
nice.
a pleasure.
How do people find you? It's RitaMcGrath.com.
RitaMcGrath.com. It's incredibly inventive, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know. Did you trademark that? Because I think that's important to protect. So I'll tell a quick sidebar. I think it was early GPT-3, right? And I was on something. It might have been LinkedIn. Probably was. And somebody was talking about creating an AI engine that could be your favorite strategist. Do you remember that?
Yes. Oh, yeah, that's right.
I saw this.
It was the Board of Innovation.
And it was like, you could be Clay Christensen, or you could be Rita McGrath, or you could be Michael Porter. And I went on there and I'm like, so I clicked in and went to a website. And I said, I have a question. I want to be Rita McGrath. And it answers it with a lot of Craig Christensen's work, if I remember correctly. Some of your work. And it was like all over the map. And I'm like, this is blatant theft of intellectual property.
Oh, yeah. And the tagline, if you remember, was all of the insights without the high price tag.
Exactly. So I sent that to you and I said, this is kind of weird. Like, what's going on? And we chatted about it. And I said, I'm going to send them a note, right? I sent them a quick note saying, you're kind of stealing Rita McGrath's intellectual property here. And they came back really quickly and said, oh, no, that's not what we're doing.
It was the intern. It was the intern.
Yeah, the same one that tweets at the White House. That same person.
Yeah. Exactly.
He's everywhere. And the website came down, right? And I think that's, I think it's so critically important that in the age of AI, we understand where things come from. And part of this wellness thing, so where am I going with this? I tell people, don't watch the news. And I don't literally mean don't watch the news, but certainly don't do it first thing in the morning. Don't set your day up with CNN and Fox. And we live in a society where, 50% of the people hate 50% of the people, right? And 50% of the people hate 50% of the people. And I use the word hate not casually. I mean, it's true that it's a really big number. And it's very uncomfortable. One of the things I enjoy about our relationship is we can disagree. We do have different views on things. And it makes for a very, very productive partnership. And so I do appreciate that about you. Thank you. And I think all of us need to be very aware of the things that make us emotionally healthy. And having a personal board of directors, having people that you can go to and say, what do you think about something? And they go, probably not exactly right. And you go, okay, is it directionally right? Or am I on Mars here? And that's a really good example, right? And the example, what I personally tell the people that I work with is have that personal board of directors, have those people that you can go to that are, they don't need anything from you. And I coach and work with, and we both do, really powerful people and very successful people. And there's a couple of individuals I coach, and one in particular I'm thinking of, and I've said this individual many times, that everyone that talks to you will have an agenda. Everyone, including me, by the way. I have an agenda. I'm talking to you. Part of it, I'm telling you right now what it is, and part of it you will never know. And in the age of AI, it's increasingly important that we know our news sources, that we have people that we trust around us. So thank you for that. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Onward and upward to the age of abundance.
To be continued. Thanks a lot, Ron.
Thanks for